think there's so much that we can get out of the Old Testament. And one of the greatest characters in the Old Testament who you actually don't hear a whole lot about is Elisha. Here's a little bit of an overview.
The Lord sent his great messenger Elijah to anoint a prophet to follow him. God chose someone ordinary. Elijah found Elisha, a nobody, plowing his father's field. And what was Elisha's response? He burned his plow and left everything he knew to answer God's call. Elisha, a tale of ridiculous faith.
The first thing that you have to get clear, and you heard my son yell it out when we started singing about Days of Elijah, is the difference between Elijah and Elisha. Now, when I was in Sunday school as a kid, I was very confused by this. And in fact, I thought that Elisha and Elijah were the same person. It was just an old Hebrew word that was spelled differently, because there are a lot like that that are spelled a little bit differently. And I was talking with a pastor friend of mine this past week, and I said, one of my issues with the Bible in terms of naming characters is there are so many that are named very close together, where the names are sound similar, or that they have the exact same name. For instance, James is the brother of Jesus. James, the son of Alphaeus, is one of the 12 disciples. James, the son of Zebedee, is also one of the 12 disciples. And I remember the old Bob Newhart show. You kids would have no idea about this, but the one that was set in Vermont, and there was Daryl. He would introduce himself as, "I'm Daryl, and this is my other brother, Daryl." And I have to admit, when you're looking at some of these characters in the Bible, you say, "Oh my goodness, this is so confusing," because there are so many whose names sound somewhat similar. So we have Elijah and Elisha. And the best way to explain who they are is to explain or to begin with the name of our church, Whispering Winds. That name originated in a passage from 1 Kings chapter 19 that discusses an incident in the life of Elijah, the prophet Elijah. Well, Elijah was depressed. He was miserable. He'd been out preaching about God, telling people about God, prophesying, and he felt like the whole world had turned on him. He felt like nobody liked him anymore. His life was in danger, and he felt like he was alone. He was depressed. He was living in a state of gloom. So what did he do? He decided to run away. He decided he was going to run away and tell God, "I quit. I'm no longer going to talk about God. I am going to turn my back on everything that has to do with God." So he went to a mountain to be alone with God. He disappeared into a cave. And on that mountain, God confronted Elijah. He asked him, "What are you doing here? Why aren't you out doing what I called you to do?" And Elijah explained that he was in despair because he was the only prophet left. There was nobody else out there. And in that he was also a hunted man. The fact is, Elijah was wrong. There were plenty of other prophets out there. There were plenty of other people that were still talking about God. And what Elijah wasn't understanding was that his feelings had overtaken the facts. The facts of the situation were very simple. There were other people. Other passages talk about the fact that there were other prophets out there. But Elijah was so caught up in his own gloom and depression that he didn't know, or he didn't see, that there were other people like him out there. So other passages that describe these hundreds of other prophets speaking didn't matter to Elijah, because all he could see was his own life, and he was depressed. So instead of trying to argue with Elijah, God decided to have a direct encounter with Elijah. This was an encounter that resonates deeply with me, as you probably are aware, because it did become the name of this church. And it's from 1 Kings 19, 11, and 12. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. That whisper Elijah recognized as the voice of God. We don't know what God said. We don't know if the words were comforting. We don't know even if God said anything specific at all. What we do know is that Elijah's vision of God changed in that moment. He had a new mission in life. His fire was rekindled, and he was a changed man. So what was Elijah's new mission? What was his new commission? What was Elijah going to do now that was so different than when he began his ministry? His job was to recruit others to join him. And that is where Elisha joins the story. Elijah began recruiting with a man named Elisha. From a human perspective, what happened in this next incident is absolutely ridiculous. Elijah would be chosen to do something great. It was ridiculous to think that Elijah would receive a mission from God because of his position and what he was doing at the time he was called. That's what makes this story so great. It was ridiculous to think that Elijah would be the one chosen by God, and yet he was. And it is not an exaggeration to say that Elijah had to have a ridiculous faith to make this kind of ridiculous commission. 1 Kings 19 and 21 tells the story. So Elijah went from there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. Elijah then left his oxen and ran after Elijah. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye," he said, "and I will come with you." "Go back," Elijah replied. "What have I done to you?" So Elijah left him and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he set out to follow Elijah and become his servant. There are some things we can figure out from reading this passage. He was a very ordinary guy. There was nothing special about Elisha. He was living at home, working for his parents. He didn't seem to have any divine calling. There wasn't anything special about him. There's nothing in the Bible that tells us he held a position as a priest, as a leader, a church leader of any kind. There was nothing that was ever uttered in the entire Old Testament that gave any indication that Elijah was somebody special. So here he was working at his parents' farm. It was a prosperous farm. How do we know that? Because he was pushing or behind 12 oxen. Normal families at the time would have 1 oxen and be working in a field. So it was a prosperous family. Apparently, when Elijah walked up to him, recognized him, because there isn't much question about who he is or what he was doing there. And this is where things get ridiculous. Elijah was doing a job he did every day. He was working the fields, as he'd probably done since he was a child. He was doing something so ordinary and so monotonous that he probably never imagined doing anything different. And this is all he knew. This is what he lived for. This is what he lived to do. We've probably all been there at one time or another in our own lives. We're going along perfectly satisfied. We like where we are. We're comfortable with the situation. We're perfectly satisfied to get up every morning, doing the same thing, going to school, going to work, repeating the same actions, repeating the same life over and over again. Sometimes it's hard to hear God calling us when we are perfectly satisfied with where we are. We don't know any different. Could that be the position of Elijah at this time? Was he perfectly satisfied with a future taking over the family farm and walking behind those oxen every day for the rest of his life? Comfort in our lives can lead to false satisfaction. And false satisfaction can lead to a loss of passion. So Elijah walks up to Elisha and he throws his cloak on him. Now this was a symbol Elisha understood. He knew instantly when Elijah threw that cloak on him that he was appointing him to an office of some kind. God was calling Elijah to ministry. And Elijah placing that cloak on him was the symbol of this call. And then here is the sign of ridiculous commitment. Elijah didn't even question it. God called Elijah, and he didn't even give him any details. He just obeyed. Right there, on the spot. No questions asked. What that tells me is you don't have to understand fully to obey immediately. Elijah didn't argue. He didn't complain. He didn't stop to ask if he could finish plowing the field. He obeyed immediately the call of God. This goes against everything that I do in my own life. I have to have everything mapped out. I have to have everything explained. I have to have my list of pros and cons. I need to know if something happens when I'm going this direction that I can quickly jump over and go in this direction. I have to have a backup plan. I don't know if there's many of us that when a boss tells us, this is what we're going to do, that you don't question it. You may not question to the boss, but you're going to question to the fellow employee. Can you believe that he's making us do this? Why is he making us do this? What's the reason behind it? We want to know the reasoning. We want to know the plan. We want to have it all mapped out in front of us so that we know where we're going and what we're doing. What Elijah did goes against everything that I believe in personally, that I want in my own life. What Elijah did right there is a sign of ridiculous commitment. His faith was so strong, so ridiculous, that he could say to God right there on the spot, yes, I will do what you ask immediately. I want to know that I'm qualified before I take a job. But a wise person once said, God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. There's a story from the 11th century about King Henry III of Bavaria. He grew tired of living in the castle and all the pressures of being the king and making all these decisions. And he decided he was going to change his life completely. He was going to become a monk. That, of course, is the next thing I'd think of immediately. I'm going to be a monk. He received a bit of a surprise when the head monk said, Your Majesty, do you understand that the pledge here is one of obedience? That will be hard because you are the king. You have been the one telling everybody else what to do. Now you are going to have to listen and do what you're told. The king said, Well, I understand. The rest of my life, I will be obedient to you as Christ leads you. Then the head monk said, Well, this is what I'm going to tell you to do. Go back to your throne and serve faithfully in the place where God has put you. So the King Henry did exactly as he was told. He went back to being king. And when King Henry died, a statement describing his life was written. It said, The king learned to rule by being obedient. He was one of the greatest rulers in the history of Bavaria because he learned to be obedient right where he was. Sometimes God doesn't call us to make a dramatic change. Sometimes God doesn't call us to make an entire change in our job, our position, where we are. He may be asking us to make a decision to be obedient in the position we're in. It might be different than what happened with Elijah. You don't have to understand fully to obey immediately. And as we see with King Henry III, you don't have to understand fully to obey completely. The fact is, rarely do we know why God is calling us or what He has in store for us. No matter how much I wish it to be, I don't know what is around the next corner. I don't know what trials I will face. I don't know what mountains I will have to climb. I don't know where the next trail will lead. I want details. But God just wants my heart. I would never take a step out of my house if I knew some of the things that were in front of me. If I had known in January all the things that would happen after January, I wouldn't let my family leave the house. We'd all just stay there. The fact is, we don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know what God is preparing us for. But God knows our hearts. He knows our faith. He knows that there's only so much we as humans can handle. But He does expect us to obey immediately and completely. I love the way Pastor Craig Groeschel puts it. He says, just one word sometimes is all God's going to give us. And that needs to be enough. In the Old Testament, whenever God was giving Moses direction, God used one word. He'd say, Moses, go. Abraham, go. Go to the land that I will show you. Jesus is walking on the water in the New Testament, and Peter wanted to do the same thing. So what did Jesus say? He said, come. One word. No details. No discussions about physics and how this was even possible that he was walking on the water. One word. Come. You don't have to understand fully to obey immediately. You don't have to understand fully to obey completely. And finally, the ones God uses the most are the ones who hold on to the least. After Elijah said that he wanted to kiss his parents goodbye, which makes sense, Elijah said something very strange in verse 20. He says, what have I done to you? Now, commentators have debated what that means. Why was Elijah saying to Elijah, what have I done to you, when he said he wanted to go kiss his parents? Most of the commentators have come to the conclusion that Elijah is saying, it's up to you. You have to decide what is most important to you. Yes, kiss your parents, but what are you going to do with God's call? And at this point, it was almost as if Elisha had something to prove to Elijah. The Bible tells us that he killed the oxen. He burned his plow and used the burning plow and this burning farm equipment to cook the oxen to feed all of the workers at the farm. In doing that, Elijah celebrated his past, but it set it permanently behind him. And in the process, Elijah declared what was most important. He didn't hold on to the past. He didn't hold on to plan B. Most people would have left the plowing equipment home, stuck it in the barn, and had it ready just in case plan A didn't work out. Most people, including me, would have done that. They wanted that plan B in their back pocket. That's the way I am. I like to have plan B in my back pocket, ready to go when things don't work out, so that I always have that to fall back on. But that's not what God wants of us. God wants us always to stick to plan A and forget about everything else. Remember these words: those God uses the most are the ones who hold on to the least. That means we remove every other option except God's option. Wouldn't it have made more sense for Elijah to keep the oxen, to keep the plowing equipment, keep his job open with his family in case things went wrong? From our perspective, of course. From God's perspective, of course not. God wants our full commitment. And when we hold on to the past, God can't use us completely because we aren't committed completely. What Elijah did was a sign of ridiculous commitment. Ridiculous in the eyes of man, but completely in the eyes of God. I know there are still things in my life that stand in the way of completely serving God. God calls us to burn those plows, burn those bridges, sell out completely to God. I think every single one of us has a plow or two to burn in our own lives. Anything that keeps us from serving God is a plow we need to burn. If we're holding on, we're keeping ourselves from fully giving everything to God. And to do that, it takes a deep and abiding faith in God. Now, in the coming weeks, we're going to learn more about the ridiculous faith of Elijah. We're going to talk about digging ditches next week as an example of ridiculous faith. The first Sunday in October, we're going to turn to ridiculous provision. We're going to see a widow who was desperate and found that God supplies all of our needs, no matter what they are. And finally, we're going to see an amazing miracle as an axe floats on the water with ridiculous recovery. But today, we see an example of ridiculous commitment. Elijah shows us that you don't have to understand fully to obey immediately. You don't have to understand fully to obey completely. And the ones God uses the most are the ones who hold on to the least. God accepts us just the way we are, and He meets us right where we are. But He loves us too much to leave us there. Those are the words of Andrew Womack, and I think they're wonderful. God accepts us just the way we are, and He meets us right where we are. But He loves us too much to leave us there.